All right, next, well, Angie, you're part of this too, so are you staying at the table with Greg, or? Okay, oh, he's going solo, all right, very good. The next item is the reports requirement task force. This is a actionable item. I think what might be in the backups, the proposed motion would most likely will be that the board directs staff to move to committees the reports and requirements task force recommendation as described. We have program analyst Greg here that's going to speak to the work. Several of us are on that task force. We'll turn the time over to you. Again, this is just to receive them, not to act on them.
Thank you, Chair Huntsman. I told Deputy Superintendent Stallings that if I start looking like a scared bunny up here, then she should run up here and save me. But I will try and do it solo, and any questions you have, I'm happy to answer. So thank you, board members, for hearing me today. I'm happy to report on the Reports and Requirements Task Force and the work that we've been doing. I'd also like to thank Chair Huntsman for his leadership and for all the help of the staff that has and the board members that have been on that task force and committee. So the task force was created in response to the 2021 House Bill 300 run by Representative Pulsifer. The House bill looked at reviewing the reports and requirements on LEAs to try and reduce burdens on our LEAs, and also the House bill also allowed for the Utah State Board of Education to make a recommendation to the legislature should any reports or requirements need to be changed legislatively. The task force was created by Chair Huntsman and put together, and staff previous to the task force worked on compiling a list of all the required reports and requirements that are in statute and code and board rule, so that we have a good list of all the different requirements. And then we also created surveys so that we could help fulfill the purposes of this legislation. The scope was written out in the legislation for us, and I just want to highlight a few of the things that were put into the legislation that has been really important to our task force, and that also is put into our surveys as well, and that is looking at the purpose and effectiveness of the report, to look at whether or not accountability and transparency can be achieved through any other means, and whether or not there's a less burdensome way to collect that information, and ultimately also whether or not the USIMS programs would ultimately affect the report and the data collection. So we use that in creating our surveys. And as we created the task force, the goal that we had was to review these reports and ultimately bring recommendations to the Utah State Board of Education for ways that they could work either with legislation or in their own board rules, or with staff to look at taking any recommendations that came out of this task force. So a little bit about the task force. We first met on August 9th, 2022. That was our first meeting, and since then we've met a total of 6 times. The task force is made up of 34 members. Those members include representatives from the House and Senate and their staff. It also includes representatives from the Utah State Board of Education, as well as many staff members, representatives from the State Charter School Board and their staff, representatives of superintendents and district leadership and charter school directors, representatives of the business administrators, both from district and charter schools, as well as representatives from the superintendency and charter school networks. Staff created 120 surveys. We have not administered 120 surveys, but we have done a significant amount of surveying, and I'm sure our LEAs are thinking that's just one more survey coming down the pipeline. And we do recognize the irony of surveying and collecting data on how to reduce surveying and collecting data. However, we don't have a better way of doing that at this point. So our government work goes on. We've spent a combined 350 total hours as a task force. That doesn't include the amount of time that staff from the USBE as well as LEAs in general have spent answering surveys, sending out surveys, or analyzing the results and presenting and creating presentations for the task force. So there's a lot more time that has been spent outside of our task force by our members and by LEAs in general. In response to the surveys, we've been pretty pleased. LEAs have been responsive. We've received over 100 responses to our surveys that we've sent out, and those responses have really helped shape and provide feedback to us when making recommendations to the task force. Our task force decided to begin by requesting the low-hanging fruit from its members, and we used low-hanging fruit as a way of saying those reports that are on the minds of our LEAs that they already know could be bettered, could be reduced, or aren't necessary. And so we sent out, we asked our task force members to provide us the low-hanging fruit, and we received over 34 different responses. Some of those responses, about 34 of them, were reports that were as outlined in the bill, and some of those responses were ideas of improving different pain points that LEAs have that weren't necessarily reports and requirements as outlined in code or rule. But we took those down as well and put them in what we call the parking lot, and that's an area that we kept all the different ideas that came out of this task force that weren't necessarily related, that we thought would be important and that would also help out our LEAs. And some of those parking lot ideas will come before you today as recommendations as well. One of the nice things that has been accomplished with this task force is the amount of feedback and insights that have both been given to the Utah State Board of Education representatives and staff, as well as the feedback, insights, and historical information that we've been able to provide to LEAs themselves. And on more than one occasion, we've had members leave our meetings thankful and happy that they were able to spend those 2 hours with us around this table, because they were able to get some insights that they hadn't had before and understood the work that the USBE was doing behind the scenes, as well as the historical context that had come before that led to the different laws and codes that we currently have. And so ultimately, the thing that we're very proud of is that we were able to formalize some recommendations for this board, which we'll share with you today, on ideas that the task force has felt would improve and reduce burdens for, not improve burdens, but improve the time for teachers to teach and reduce burdens for our LEAs so that they can go on and instruct our children. So some of the reports that we reviewed in these 6 meetings that we were able to have was the career and technical education reports, the requirements on reporting for school fees, the requirements for our full-day kindergarten and OEK, the school plant capital outlay report, reports on benchmark assessments for data for grades 1 through 3, the administration of adult education, and the annual assurances report. Aside from those reports, we also had the opportunity to look at some of the pain points that were in the parking lot. And so some of the other ideas, not only just pain points, but some of the other ideas that also came from our task force of things to look into and review were the Aspire, the Utah Grants, the USIMS project, the Legal Requirements project, and the Common Needs Assessment project. And I just want to thank staff from the USBE for making time, not only in those reports previously mentioned, but also in these items for making time and spending time so that they could come and present to our task force as well. So the recommendations that we were able to come with, I'll share with you. These recommendations were created by the task force on consensus. And our first one has to do with the full-day kindergarten and OEK. It is the task force recommendation to this board to place the funding for kindergarten in the WPU. In terms of reducing reports and requirements, currently there's 2 different pots going for kindergarten. And so by placing it in the WPU, kindergarten would be basically prorated based on the student's attendance to that school, whether it be half-time or full-time, and it would reduce significantly the amount of reporting that schools have to do to try and take money from both those pots. that currently govern our kindergarten classes and their funding. The second recommendation is along adult education. The recommendation is to amend R 277-733 to eliminate the fee reports for non-federally funded programs. And the second recommendation with adult education is to integrate reporting into the new UASIS, or the Utah Adult Student Information System, and digitize it. So currently, there is information being collected from LEAs that is not at the federal level, and we do not use that information. And so the idea is to get rid of all that information we're not currently using and just collect the federally required information that we do use, and then make that easier to collect by making it a digital collection. Our third recommendation comes from the school fees section, and the recommendation is to repeal the Certificate of Compliance reporting requirements to the USBE. Currently, USBE staff don't audit these Certificate of Compliance reporting requirements, and so it's essentially just a checkbox of yes, we did it. And so without auditing it, there's really no value in checking this box. And what is instead proposed is that the school fees team would rather, on their site visits, when they do go out to schools, is ask these similar questions that are in these Certificate of Compliance of the schools. And that way it will be more of a spot check, and they can still get the same information, but would have more value and actually be meaningful. Our fourth recommendation is the school plant capital outlay report. Comes from that section, and the recommendation to the board is to amend R 277-471-14, and that would reduce the reporting requirements on LEAs due to the USB having access in-house to all the necessary information. So currently, the information that schools are providing in this report is already information that's inputted into the USB system, and we can pull it internally. So there's no reason to ask the schools to again report this information to us. Our fifth recommendation from the task force has to do with the Aspire system. This is one of those parking lot, not necessarily a reports and requirements in code or rule, but it became an important point, and so we're passing the recommendation along to the USB as well. The recommendation is to allocate available manpower and resources to improving and enhancing the infrastructure and capabilities of the Aspire student information system beyond just maintaining the system. During our discussion, it was found that the Aspire system would really help in some of the collection of data, and that having it in the Aspire system would make it possible for us for the USBE to pull it from the back end rather than having to ask it in separate reports or separate surveys. Our sixth recommendation has to do with the USIMS project, and that the task force would like to recommend to the USBE to prioritize the USIMS project as priority number one. Currently, there's a lot of projects that take up the time of those staff and employees that are working on USIMS, and so by prioritizing this project as number one, the task force believes that it could get done a little sooner. And the USIMS project would also significantly reduce the amount of data collection time that LEAs have to take, because it would be able to, again, be pulled on the back end. USB would be able to push and pull data, and so that would reduce a lot of the burden that's currently happening for administrative personnel at schools. And our last recommendation comes from Utah Grants, and the recommendation for the task force, this again is one of those parking lot ideas, is to make Utah Grants all-inclusive of links and requirements for each grant. Currently, right now, on the LEA side, when they go to Utah Grants, there's no list of things they have to complete in that specific Utah Grants computer program. And so in order to make sure that you're hitting each point of the grant, you have to go to separate areas to look up what's requirements for the grant. And then when you are doing those requirements, there's different applications that are used. And so you might have to have a number of different windows open. on different applications to actually complete the single Utah grant that you're looking to complete. And so LEA's in our task force recommended that it be all-inclusive in one system so that when they go there, they can have all their requirements as well as have the links to each of those requirements instead of trying to search it out in different areas. And before I take your questions, I'd just like to show you the task force dashboard that we have created. We have this, it's on Tableau Public, so it's accessible by anyone. You just go to Tableau Public and then search in the search bar, reports and requirements. And if you put the whole name in, it'll probably come up faster. But this is a dashboard that is keeping track of each recommendation that we're making to the board. You see on the left-hand side over here where it says task force. This is the task force tab. So right now, all these reports are housed within the task force. And here's how you get to it. Each of these reports are housed in the task force tab until they're moved on to the board. And once the board has them, then we'll go ahead and move them to the boards tab, which will be accessible here once one of these has a board option. And then over here in the middle, you see the statute and rules that are associated with each report. And then on the right-hand side of that table, you'll see the current status of that report. So the majority of these are recommended to the board. We have a few that we didn't bring, as you'll notice, the reports on benchmark assessment data for grades 1 through 3. We haven't come to a consensus on that, on those recommendations, so it's still in review. But as you scroll down, you'll be able to access and see different reports. If you hover over the particular report, you can see some notes that are associated with this report. Those notes give just a brief synopsis on what's the recommendation and a little bit of additional information. And those can change as it heads to new bodies, and they can also change as new recommendations are made or actions are taken. On the right-hand side, you see reports reduced. If you hover over this little bubble, you'll notice there's reduced and reduced administratively. Luckily, we were able to have a win on our first day. We had the career and technical education staff come and talk to the task force, and they provided information on how they'd already administratively reduced since the passage of HB 300 the reports and requirements that had to do with that particular section. So we do have one section that was reduced administratively, and we're hoping that as we continue through, we'll have more of these numbers populate. And lastly, for your information, just a tracker on the hours of the task force members' meetings as it stands. So this doesn't take into account all the time spent outside of the task force, but we are currently at 352 hours. So with that said, I'm happy to take any questions.
Before we get into questions, what might go to the motion, I just want to add on managing expectations, a couple things I just want to state. The task force was you guys approved the task force, and then I just implemented what you said in the scope of work and how it was defined, how it was going to report. On the expectation side on this task force, as the task force makes recommendations, they go to the board, and as you receive them, and that, again, the work isn't done. There's committee work, there's opening some bill files to get kind of reserve space for tweaking and changing, but the board still has the last say in this work, and the task force is very much aware of this handoff. So the motions that will come from this most likely will go into the board space, which committee, bill files, et cetera. So I'm just, in managing everyone's expectation is, again, it's not the end game with this process. So if you guys can keep that in mind as you're getting into things. Got quite a few lights on. We'll start with Vice Chair Davis.
Again, in the interest of time, I'm going to make a motion, and then I'd like to speak briefly to it.
Let's see if we get a second.
We haven't made it yet.
Yeah, I know, that's what I'm saying. You can speak to it after you get a second.
Somebody second. I move that the board directs staff to receive and implement the reports and requirements task force recommendations as described, and to work with a legislator to open a bill file to amend the school plant capital outlay report requirements to reduce LEA reporting.
Second.
We have a motion and a second. Would you like to speak to the motion and maybe pass that over too, so I can?
Yes, I would. Thank you. This, and then add the word. I just wanted to change the language a little bit, just from receive to receive and implement, because the pieces that are coming out really are the low-hanging fruit. I mean, these are pretty simple changes, and they will reduce the reporting requirements of our LEAs some. I think we have a lot more work to do, and I think you'll see that come out in December. But I think this is a good start. The conversation is rolling. One thing to be aware of is that if there are questions about kindergarten, this changes nothing about who's doing kindergarten, who has access to kindergarten, any of that thing. It just changes the reporting requirements. So instead of the funding being labeled as OEK, it's labeled as full day K, so that the reporting requirements are significantly less for full day K than they are for OEK, but it doesn't change like who's doing it and when and whatnot. It is simply a reporting reduction. So I would encourage us to go ahead and move forward on these and leave it up to the chair.
Okay. Thank you. We've got quite a list here. Oh, it's changing as I'm, okay, Member Lear. Well, did you, Hart, you, well,
no, half
I
of there,
didn't
do not
turn,
mow
I
the
didn't turn
good.
it off. Okay, let me stay in, okay, I don't want anybody offended. Member Hart.
No,
Okay.
I can wait.
No,
Didn't
hey,
realize
you were
that it
there
was
and then
okay.
you disappeared.
All right, all right, all right. On the slide about grants management, have you looked at the specificity, like the surveys and things that they have to do as part of grants management? Like, are you looking at that level?
Chair Huntsman, is it okay if I respond?
Yeah, please.
Yeah,
So the task force didn't look at the grants management individual grants specifically. What we did have is we had a member of the task force who is a director of an LEA come and present to us by showing us on the screen some of the difficulties and pain points that they were having with the grant system. And then some other task force members were also able to contribute to that discussion as well. And so specifically, no, but we did kind of take one or two, not for any other reason other than just looking at how does it actually function on the user end. So that's about where we got with that.
can I
You have a follow-up?
quickly? Yeah. I had the privilege of just basically accidentally ending up at a UASBO conference or meeting, and I was alerted to quite a bit of redundancy. I believe that was my opinion. That's my word I put. I'd like to make sure that that is addressed in the task force if possible.
So there is a follow-up happening within the task force that Deputy Superintendent Scott Jones and staff were very receptive to betterments that can happen without, but that we've got to check to see whether the system can carry them. But there's really good consensus and a lot of, yes, we can, yeah, we can do it better, yeah, we can minimize the redundancy, yes, 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 but come back and say when and how, so.
Yeah, I think some of the surveys are required by different areas, so I think it's not just the people working in the grants management system, but the departments that are requiring the surveys, that we need to get back to them and make sure that that is actually important data to get.
There's absolutely some betterments, most likely, that will surface from round one of that dialogue and
Great.
that took place.
Great, thank you.
Okay, Member Lear.
I had a question that I may have missed at the beginning of your discussion. I wondered if there is, on that nifty website that you demonstrated, if there's a list of task force members, or where I'd find that list.
There is not on that dashboard that we have. There is a list that is internally held, and we can get it to
board.
you.
Shouldn't that be, I mean, I think it would be really helpful. I'm just one person, but I think others might have ideas that they'd like to communicate to one of those members, and that would further their knowledge base, and then they can bring it to the task force. So and if people are not terribly offended, it would be helpful to have a public email address and a name of the people on that task force.
That'd be great. Yeah, we can do that.
And, right, or a contact, I guess your contact too, but sometimes if you want more of an advocate for what you're talking about, it might be helpful to be able to contact a member too.
Okay.
Thanks.
Member-
And you'll get me the list, and then we'll go
We'll,
for.
we'll look at how we
making-
post it.
All
Okay.
right, thank you.
Member Cannon.
So this is sort of an all-encompassing question. You've gone through it with the task force, you've met many times, and I'm wondering if you have some kind of clarity around how much time and effort this is going to save LEAs. If we implement all of these recommendations, what good have we done? Can you give me a general accounting?
That is one of the questions that we do have on our survey when we send out about the specific reports and requirements task force in code or rule. And LEAs have provided a range of different hours and money that might save. I have not compiled that as of yet, but that is something we could look into compiling based on our recommendations that go through.
Yeah, I think it would lend more support to what's going on here if we had that kind of information to look at. Thank you.
Okay. Member Booth. Well,
I would just like to say that this is a happy day in Nebo School District and a lot of other school districts across the state, as well as charter schools. And it's the beginning, and I'm grateful for this exciting beginning and look forward to continuing down this pathway. Thank you.
Okay. Member Hanson.
I'm happy, let me see, I'm happy for this beginning too, but I had some questions kind of about where the end is or what the scope of this is. Do we have any idea how many reports and requirements there are out there that we're dealing with?
So maybe you can speak to the other, there was another reference to a report that's outside of this that's going to benefit the group, but
Sure.
we hired somebody to help us.
So there's a number of projects kind of going on at the same time. We had the legal requirements project, which is a huge undertaking that Tracy Nettle is doing for us. And she's looking at all the different requirements on schools, both in code and in rule, and compiling kind of some list ideas just to kind of get a scope of how much is actually required, and also are those requirements still being used? And so that's one of the projects that's going on aside from this one. On this project specifically, we have, as I mentioned, 120-something surveys on required reports in code and in rule. Some of those are kind of combined together. So the Utah grants, there's a lot of reporting requirements along those lines with reporting on your funding. And so we kind of looked at probably a good chunk of those all at the same time. So 120 surveys, probably not quite that many exactly on the reports, because some of those reports have been individualized on the specifics. And so, I'm
Is it a question
missing the
with
rest of the question.
time? I think you had one on.
Yeah, well, let me ask it then again, maybe a different way. So we've done, there's 5, I think, recommendations that have to do with specific reports, right? And there's a couple of others that are the parking lot items that you talked about. So does that represent 0.5% maybe of the total apple that we're biting into? Is that 1/10%? Is that,
Yeah, I think that is a very small percentage. I think this is a big undertaking that we're taking with this task force. And luckily, we've been pretty lucky with the members being very involved. With 2 hours each, 2 times a month, we're able to get through 3 reporting requirements if we're lucky. And those are the pain points, the low-hanging fruits. When we get into the bigger ones that have, I guess, more diverse opinions on those different reporting requirements, we might just do 1 at a task force meeting. But hopefully, there's some other low-hanging fruits where we could maybe do, I don't know, 4 or 5 at a meeting. But so far, we've been pretty good with getting to 3 of the reporting requirements.
And if I might be able to add to this, we're allowing the membership so we can keep them engaged to pick and choose and prioritize what's on their radar. And now we're knocking down that list, and we're kicking off, I think in December, we'll be hitting statutory things. So I think this is going to build momentum and still keep the group together. But one of the big parts of keeping the group together is having that dashboard to measure progress and make sure that they're relevant. And then they can still track what we do with the recommendation as the water gets to the end of the road. But it's been a good start, but a little bit of a slow start. But it's about engaging a lot of the stakeholders. They've also been charged, just FYI, that because of who they are and the associations that they're with, to go back to their organizations and have them be doing some legwork to come up with recommendations also that comes in before us. So it's just not a raw discovery. And so we're trying to build momentum there. So based on, we're not to a sprint, but we're on a good walk and everybody's together. So I think we can up the pace, but we'll see what happens.
Thank
I don't know
you.
if that answers your
That's-
question.
No, that's helpful. I appreciate that because I see, at this stage, 350 man-hours, and we've got 5 suggestions. I assume that a lot of that is groundwork. Now we've got a dashboard. Now we've got some of this survey data. And so I'd believe that the task force would anticipate this is going to accelerate. Is that correct?
Yeah, I think now that we've kind of we have our pattern down of how meetings are going to go, how discussions go, I think it should speed up.
Okay, thank you. And then just one other one that's specific.
Yes.
So the school fees report that we're eliminating, I'm remembering all the heartache we've been through with school fees. And I'm wondering if the answer there is that we ought to just look at those reports, those certification reports, and make them valuable instead of eliminating them and risking going back and undoing the work that whole school fees group did over the past, I don't know how many years it was, to try to get that all lined up. I think, for me at least, there's some value in having that requirement there, so each of the schools know we have to check what we're doing with school fees and then certify that we're doing it okay. And it's kind of a philosophical thing, but I didn't see that that's being replaced by anything. I didn't see that there's another way to get that data. What I saw is we're not looking at it, so we're going to chop it off. Can you comment on that?
Sure. So that was an idea that was brought to us from the school fees team, staff themselves, based on the fact that the data is collected, and that's kind of where it sits. And so without an auditing process to that data, it's more of just checking a box, yes or no, and you're probably going to get all yeses. To the collecting that data, the school fees team idea is that they could still kind of collect that certification data, but they wouldn't be doing it in the just check a box LEAs. It would be at a site visit when they're actually going through that school's fees and their calendar and all the other items. And so they could then use that certification list or those ideas to then go through and do their check of the school. Then it wouldn't be a full check as the current certification is, although the validity of that check is questionable since it's just a checkbox. But it would be a sampling of LEAs each year, depending on that school fees team's schedule of which LEAs they're checking that year. And so you would be able to gather a sampling of that information. That way it just wouldn't be in a full every school check that year.
So, and Greg, but the explanation that you have and the opportunity for board input is going to be in committee, and then it goes before the full board. So it's just, this is starting the water down the roll for board consideration, and then
So help
this
me
will get weighed out.
Yeah, help me understand, because I'm ready to make a motion to amend, to adopt all this except for the school fees part, because that's a big question mark for me.
Okay, Angie's wanting to weigh in too. Well, this doesn't make it happen. What this does is it puts it,
So help me understand how it's going to come back so that somebody can look at it, because we went through a lot of pain in that area.
yeah.
Chairman.
Yes.
Yes, so that rule is in Finance Committee tomorrow. And during the discussion of the school fees reporting, what the staff found is that the compliance reports that come in, remember, there's 1,100 approximately principals who were filling those out, and then 150-ish, 160 superintendents, charter directors, and then the same number of board chairs for the governing boards. And what they found is that most of those certificates of compliance were being returned with, yes, we're in compliance. It was then through the monitoring or administrative reviews that when they would go and meet with LEAs and actually review their policies and the materials, that they were able to find out how the LEAs were doing and to have that training. And so what school fees staff found or felt is that the amount of effort that's being taken to fill out those compliance reviews are not resulting in actual training, increased knowledge, or increased compliance. That the increased compliance, knowledge, training, et cetera, comes from the monitoring and the administrative reviews. And so that was the discussion that the task force had, and that is why they vote. The task force did have an option on the table to continue those certificates of compliance. But I believe, and I don't want to say it was unanimous, but I think it might have been unanimous from the task force to move away from the certificates of compliance, continue to require those data points, the information to be collected and maintained, but to have that available upon request when they are monitored. And that is what the school fees staff found, is that the certificates of compliance, the spirit of the permanent injunction in requiring those certificates of compliance was exactly for the reason that you just mentioned, Board Member Hanson. It was the idea that if we have them check this annually, it'll remind them of their requirements, it'll be a training of sorts, and it'll result in increased compliance. What staff have found is that is not the case. It has instead been more, and I don't want to use this word busy work, but it's not there that you're actually seeing increased compliance, training, knowledge. It's through the monitoring.
Okay, maybe to follow up, so monitoring means sampling 5 schools a year, 10 schools a year out of
It's
all of
more
them?
than that. I don't know if Barbie's here. This
Because
will,
I personally, I guess I have some difficulty there. I think that when you say the effort required for this compliance document, it sounds like no effort is being required for the compliance document. It's crossing someone's desk, they're checking it, and we see that as no guarantee. So there's some accountability in checking that box. And on this one, I agree, and a lot of times compliance documents, we don't need those. But on this one, we have experienced a lot of pain. We put a lot of man hours into trying to get this straight, and to let it drift off into, disrepair potentially, with not having some kind of, hold the people accountable who are supposed to be checking the box. So I'll just, I guess, voice that opinion, and you tell me how this is going to come back before the board, Chair. If I need to make a motion to amend, I'll
Well,
make
how
a
it
motion
comes
to
out,
amend.
if there's a change, and this is by design, because there's so many of the stakeholders are still here that experience all of the school fees, is if something comes out of, a proposed change comes out of finance, it goes for the full board in December, and you will have a chance to weigh in on that final motion. Or if it doesn't, then you're gone, and then your institutional knowledge and
I'm
others.
just talking about the board. I'm not talking about
Yeah,
me
but I'm talking about the
personally. There's a lot of
board.
work that's going to be done.
But the work that's going to be done is, that will be discussed because it came out of committee, and what moves out of committee goes before the full board. And if you want to amend something as it comes before the full board, you can, or.
Let me do this, and I'll just make a motion to amend And I don't know that we have Cindy's motion exactly spelled out here, but I just add to the end of it with the exception of the recommendation on school fees compliance.
So you want to,
Yeah, that's hers, number one.
End of that, just with the exception of the recommendation on school fees compliance.
I'll second that.
yeah, we're good, whatever.
So again, receive and implement, but with the exception of that one, I'd like that to be looked at.
Okay, we have an amendment with a second. Did you want to speak more to it? Member Hanson?
No, I've spoken.
Okay, what's on the table is the amendment. So I've got a ton of lights on. So if for hands up on the proposed amendment, I can.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5.
Okay, I'll just go around this way. I'm sorry, I didn't see them all come up. Member Hart?
Yeah, I want to clarify that there's a lot of different data collection points with school fees outside of the compliance document. There are spend plans that are required, there's financial accounting with the fees. The compliance document really, quite frankly, is, we make fun of it every year because, it doesn't, yes, we do it, but then we do spend plans, we do all of our financial accounting that's audited, we do all of our documentation. It's got to go to our local boards 2 times and reflected in their minutes. There's so much more robust that piece of paper doesn't show that people understand the process or people are following the process. So I would be against that motion.
Okay,
And if I could just add to that, there are, like Member Hart said, there are multiple checkpoints already with school fees. This is not taking away that accountability at all. I also want to make a point in relation to that, that I think as we're looking at reducing reporting, we're looking at the burden on the LEAs and school leaders, but we're also looking at the burden that we're placing on USBE staff. And this is one in particular I'm looking at. If they're not having to chase down school leaders to reply to this report, if they're not having to chase down board chairs to reply to this report, maybe they could do a couple more audits each year.
Great. For that, for sure.
okay. Did you have a, yes,
Yes.
That was actually brought up.
Board Member,
Angie?
Yes, Board Member Hutchings, that was exactly what the school fees staff stated, is that it takes a couple of months to collect the, 1,300 or 1,400 certificates of compliance, calling, telling people, and that they actually stated they could do additional monitoring with that time.
okay. Member Booth, was your hand raised on this round? See, that was Norton. Now we're over here, Earl.
Yeah, so this is back to our last discussion, but we're receiving this information and then we can act on it or not act on it. And so, no, this is different?
Implement, receive and
Oh,
It's different.
okay, thank you, because I'm
Except
seeing the
implement.
receive.
Just wanted to make sure you had it.
Okay, very good. Okay, something to ponder.
Okay. Member Straight.
I'm thinking. So if I'm remembering the discussion properly, and if I get it wrong, I want to be corrected. These same concerns came up during that meeting. I am on the task force for, that we actually, under the circumstances, have 100% compliance when we have those audits. So am I missing something? Help.
Angie.
So my recollection, and Barbie Faust is not here with us right now, and she will be in committee tomorrow. So the idea was that this motion would set in motion, that a draft of the board rule would be presented to finance with the recommendations, but of course could be amended and not accepted by the committee or the board. But she'll be there to answer this. But it was that you might have an LEA who, there are 3 certificates of compliance, or many, because you've got a number of principals in each LEA, but you'll at least have the board chair and at least the charter director or the superintendent, that they might say 100% compliant. We are 100% compliant. But then when they went to do the administrative reviews, the people thought they were in compliance, but when they checked, they found that there were certain things that their understanding of what was on the certificate of compliance wasn't what others believe. And so in a lot of ways, the certificate of compliance provides a false sense of we're in compliance, where the administrative review ended up being a check and then a training opportunity, an opportunity to, or, say, here's what this really means, and here's how you could improve your systems or process.
Thank you. And I know that at the time there were concerns, and I had concerns, but I remember at the end of the discussion, I felt fine about it. And so I'm going to not support this amendment. Thank you.
Member Laird?
I'm rethinking my second, and I'm rethinking this. All I know is there is no one else here who has lived this school fees discussion from the 1990s until now but me. And all I know is this is deja vu all over again, that there was just the fiery words and stamping of feet in the 1990s. These schools are not doing what they're supposed to. Well, then I guess we need to monitor them. And at the time, there were 40 LEAs. And now we have 160-ish LEAs. And as I looked at the school fees rule, and as I look at now hear this, there's just a gradual erosion, just like what happened in the late 90s and into the 2000s of, this is too much work. We're setting ourselves up for failure. We can't do this. And all of those hundreds of hours that were spent in that school fees task force and all the PTSD we gave LEAs and everything else will be for naught, because gradually it is not doable to monitor this at the level that we need to make sure every child who's entitled to a fee waiver gets it. Especially because I don't know that, maybe it's not even possible. We're not bringing people along voluntarily with this. There's a lot of resistance at the LEA level because there's not enough money to cover all the fees that parents, for the activities that parents expect, and also and I love that in the, I'm digressing just a moment, but I love that in the finance rule, now we're going to ignore the fact that there was a permanent injunction, because I guess it's just not permanent anymore, so we're not going to mention it, because we aren't complying with that. So I just this may not be the place to dig our heels in, I was just saying to Scott, but if we really mean this, we've got to find the will, the time, the energy to now monitor. And Scott's right, we're not going to monitor over 18 years with 180 LEAs. We'll do 10 a year. That's really great fee waiver opportunities, meaningful fee waiver opportunities for families. So we either got to say it's not doable, this is based on voluntary compliance, kind of like a speed limit, or we have to commit to doing something more than an audit of 10 LEAs every year. And so I'm really reluctant to let go of this, even because it's just one opportunity. And I know it's not foolproof. I know it's easy to just check the box. They'll never know because they'll never check. But I'm really reluctant to let go of it if all of that other work over the last 30 years has been meaningful.
Okay. Member Norton, I had you on my list, but then I think you were behind the column or something. I didn't see you.
Can I just use this?
Trying to keep the order as I saw things. So.
I really need to speak
I want to
first.
call the question.
What's that?
We have I got to clarify something.
I was calling question.
Okay, well, gonna end debate.
We're talking
Maybe.
about two different
See how it
documents.
votes. And this is what's being called a question is this amendment, this proposed amendment. Should I do a roll call? Okay. Member Cannon? So it's on the table, it's to end debate. No. Moss?
No.
Member Hart? This is to end debate.
Yeah, I know.
Hutchins?
Yes.
Yes.
Booth?
Yes.
Klein?
Yes.
Hymus?
Yes.
No.
Yes.
Not even close. So we're still in debate. Okay, so now I'm Vice Chair Davis.
Okay, I just want to make sure that I understand the amendment and the language and what we actually did in the requirements task force. So there are two different documents. There's the compliance and assurances document, and in this document, the LEA does have to mark that they are in compliance on school fees, and they have to link to their school fees policies. Is this what you want us to keep? Can I ask that question, if that's the amendment, what he's referring to in the amendment, or?
Is
If
the
it-
intent of his amendment?
Yes, is that the
his
intent of
concern
the
to
amendment?
Was that the basis of your motion?
And let me just maybe finish this. There's another document that's called the Certificate of Compliance, that's a 6-page, multi-part document that 3 different people have to answer, the principals, the board member, the business guy. That is what my understanding is, that we are asking as a task force to delete. But my understanding was not that we were asking, that we were keeping on the main compliance and assurances document, that they would still mark that they are in compliance and that they still would link their policy to this. And then in addition to that, 19 schools per year will be monitored for compliance. 19 according to Superintendent Jones. That's how many are scheduled for this year.
Every 10 years then.
And Angie? Okay, well, that's the question.
That's the question.
Okay, to answer the question.
So, yes, so what is
question
the
was first
amendment?
directed to the maker of the motion, which is Member Hanson, his intent.
Okay.
That is his
I
concern.
appreciate the discussion that's come around, and if we could look, so you had several recommendations. Can we just throw the recommendations on the screen and let me, I'll get to the point here, but if you can look at the one that's amend R277471, it's the one after this. Okay, go back to that one. Okay, so that one says that you're gonna reduce reporting due to USB having access in-house to all necessary information for the school plan capital outlay report. I understand, we're gonna eliminate that report, we've got all the data, we can still check it. Now go back to the one that we're looking at now. Repeal the certificate of compliance reporting requirements to USB, okay? And then what? So if we've got all this data that I've heard from board members that we have, can we use that to still check compliance? Is there another way that we can do this if we eliminate this report, or are we just, I read that and I say, we're not gonna have a certificate of compliance, there's no check,
And-
except for this audit that you're telling me we're gonna do. I need that information, and if we have another way, tell me, and maybe I'll withdraw my motion to amend. But right now, I'm seeing no
Angie.
check.
May I follow up, Chair, with my question?
Well, the question,
There is evidence in supporting documentation required to keep it on the single answer one.
okay,
So,
Angie.
Chair, and I'll try and answer this, and all of this is really up for debate, actually, in the rule. When we get to the rule, we could add or subtract. So, number one, I'll share with you what I know. Number one, the certificates of compliance, or the 1,300 to 1,400 individual 6-page certificates of compliance, that explicitly is what the task force recommended be removed, with support from the staff, who, through their discussion or their work, so Barbie Faust has been working with school fees now for 4 years. And I did just want to acknowledge that what we have today that we didn't have in 1994 nor in 2018 is one, at least, We now have one dedicated staff person to do monitoring. We did not have that in 2018. We did not have that in 1994. And as I was listening to Board Member Lear, I was thinking she was giving this passionate speech that would have gone well with our request for 3 FTE, but we do have one, which we didn't have before. The question that Board Member Davis proposed, you are correct that currently on the certificate, the annual assurances document, school fees is listed there. What will happen with that is still to come, because the work that Tracy Nuttall is doing with legal requirements, one of the things the Standards and Assessment Committee wanted to ask is whether we pare that document down to things that are federally, legally required only, which would mean you wouldn't include a school fees. That doesn't mean that the board couldn't say, well, we're going to have that that annual assurances be the federal legally required assurances, and these 5, right now it's probably 30 to 40, individual items that we think are important, like bullying prevention. You're right, it says this is how we're collecting our bullying prevention reporting, and give us your policy. We do that with school fees. That has been a mechanism, what I would call reporting light, or monitoring light, where we say this is how we're going to monitor, is just to require that annual check and a link to the policy. I think that's still up for debate. I would just say that's not part of this motion. It's not even required in the rule. It was something that was decided by probably staff and whoever to include that in the assurances document, and that's a to be determined later on. But I will say that, as Deputy Jones mentioned, currently 18 monitoring visits would occur. That's approximately once every 8 years. And that we do have a dedicated staff person that we didn't have. I know that I don't have the history you have, Board Member Lear, but I have been living with it since 2018. And I did feel the pain.
Versus longevity.
Yes, yeah, intensity, thank you. And I do remember the pain that USBE staff felt when we were audited and told we were not doing our job. And it wasn't because we didn't want to. We were doing the certificates of compliance. We were handing those out every year. We did not have a dedicated staff person who was actually reviewing and then supporting our LEAs to compliance. We now have that person who's monitoring and supporting LEAs to compliance. So I wanted to raise that. It's a little, we are in a different place today than we were, thank goodness, in 2018.
Could I?
Okay, did you want to, yeah.
Yeah, just specifically then, so I heard Member Hart, I heard Member Hutchins say there's other information. So we've got this other check the box kind of compliance document. Is there other information that's coming in, potentially into USIMS that we can use to check this? Because if this is in context and we have other ways to do this, and sure, let's eliminate it. But right now, it just says we're going to cut this off, and I don't know how we're going to replace it until now you told me there's these monitoring visits.
I think the question is whether you want to answer all this today or have that be part of the discussion with the rule. I know there's, as mentioned, we do receive financial reports through UPEFs, which will be part of USIMS. And I know that our monitors, so Barbie Faust, does go and look at the website. She looks for policies. She looks at the fee schedules that are approved. So there's active review going on. I don't know how much is proactively provided by the LEAs, and that's where I would need an assist from Deputy Jones or Barbie to answer.
Well, how do we best move this along then?
Well, we haven't,
The next stage. We can vote on the motion.
well, right now, it's, we have an amendment.
Yeah.
That's where we're at. That's Member Moss. We have an amendment.
After this amendment.
What's that?
My comment is for after this amendment.
It's hard for me to keep track, so I'll make another note here. Okay, so I'm not seeing any other comments, so I will, we're going to vote on the proposed amendment to add to the motion where it says option 1. The words, with the exception of the recommendation to implement the recommendations from the task force on school fees. All in favor, this is voting for this amendment, say it aye.
Aye.
Those opposed? No. Will the ayes raise their hand? And 3. Okay,
Four.
where's the 4th?
Kristen.
Oh, okay. Okay. Okay, now we're back to the original motion. Amendment doesn't move forward. Member Moss?
I'll be quick. I support the motion. I've enjoyed being vice chair and riding shotgun with Chair Huntsman on this task force. I was just going to comment that in addition to the discrete recommendations that have already come out, there's been a lot of systemic or holistic thoughts expressed during the task force. So some of those are looking across departments. We can look at one department and say, and they've done a really good job. Our staff have come in and gone kind of zero-based. What do we have and why do we have it? From federal to legislature to our board rule to the logistics of how we ask for this stuff. So in addition to that, people are asking, well, what about across the departments where I get a request here and a report there and a survey here? So we're looking at that, and I guess I'm just sort of partly speaking to report and in support of the motion, also to invite input. So I'll be meeting with the department chairs next week, I think, the 14th, talking about some of that, and that will go into that discussion. There are questions about what to take to the legislature. Are all these reports necessary? Can they be consolidated at that level? What's the purpose of them? Are they for compliance, where we need to make sure we're on it every year? Or are some of these for programmatic evaluation, where we can maybe rotate, cut back, sunset? So there's a lot of discussion that kind of goes to beyond, chopping discrete reports. Let's look at the whole system of what results in kind of this pile of paperwork and see if there are systemic ideas that we can address either internally or at the legislature. So to Carol's, Member Lear's point, feel free to send, I'm the vice chair, still working at that for now, and we'll see what happens at the end of the year, but we're still going to be planning and doing stuff, and Member Davis, Member Straight, Vice Chair Davis, Member Straight. So feel free to tell us any of that stuff that you don't think is quite being addressed. Please feel free to shoot it to us, especially at that systemic level, because that can really do big rocks, as Chair Huntsman says. So that's my support of the motion and invitation for input as well.
Member Straight?
Yeah, just a quick addition. I agree with all that, and yeah, please feel free to communicate any concerns. I would add that, for example, in regards to Utah grants, it was determined that some of those betterments could take place based on what's already in policy and what's already administrative changes that are already there in policy.
Okay, I'm not seeing any other discussion, so we'll vote. Well, I'll state the motion and then vote on the motion. And the motion before the board is that the board directs staff to receive and implement the reports and requirements task force recommendations as described, and work with the legislator to open a bill file to amend the school plant capital outlay report requirements to reduce LEA reporting. All those in favor say aye to this motion. Those opposed? Motion passes. Okay, we